The courtroom was silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grand clock mounted high above the judge's bench. James Callahan, an old man in his late 70s, stood tall despite his frail body, his military uniform worn proudly as he faced the judge. Beside him, leashed and sitting obediently, was Shadow, his wolf, his only companion, his only family. James' hands trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the leash, his heart heavy with the thought of losing Shadow. The murmurs from the audience filled the room, whispers of fear, of outrage, of disbelief. How could a man, a former U.S. Army official, harbor a wild animal in his home? But they didn't know the story. They didn't know what Shadow meant to him. The judge, an older man himself with kind but firm eyes, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Callahan, do you understand the seriousness of this situation? Keeping a wolf in a residential neighborhood is against the law. The people are frightened." James swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving Shadow, who sat unmoving. His piercing yellow eyes locked on him as if sensing the gravity of the situation. He took a deep breath and finally spoke. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I need you to hear my story before you pass judgment." A hush fell over the room as James began. It had been years ago, in a jungle on foreign soil, where the air was thick with smoke and the sound of gunfire was never far away. James had been stationed in a remote war zone, his unit tasked with reconnaissance and aid. One fateful night, after a brutal skirmish, he had stumbled across a small, whimpering creature nestled between the roots of a great tree, covered in dirt and blood. At first, he had thought it was a stray dog, abandoned and alone. But as he cradled the tiny thing in his arms, he realized the truth. It was a wolf pup. His fellow soldiers had warned him against keeping it. A wild animal had no place in a war zone, they said. But James couldn't leave it. Something in its frightened eyes, in the way it pressed against his chest, had struck a chord in him. He named him Shadow because he followed him everywhere, never making a sound, just a silent protector, always by his side. They had survived together, through nights of deafening explosions and days of relentless heat, until James' deployment ended. Bringing Shadow back home had been a challenge. He had falsified some papers, claimed Shadow was a dog, and smuggled him across borders. He had done everything to ensure his survival. When they had finally landed in the States, he had hoped for a peaceful life. And for years they had just that. Shadow had been more than a pet. He had been James' only companion in a life that had grown lonelier with age. His wife had passed away years ago, and his children had moved far, caught up in their own lives. It was just him and Shadow, living a quiet life in his modest home in a small suburban neighborhood. To keep Shadow safe, James had done everything possible to disguise his true nature. He kept his coat trimmed, dressed him in dog clothes, and ensured he never roamed freely. Shadow never caused harm. He was disciplined, trained with the rigor James had once instilled in his fellow soldiers. But still, James knew the risk. If anyone ever found out, they would take him away. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been late. James had gone to bed early, his body growing weaker with age. Shadow had curled up by the door, as he always did, a silent guardian in the night. But something had been off that evening. A shadowy figure had moved through the darkness, slipping past the fence, prying open the window. A thief, armed and desperate. The man had moved quietly, making his way upstairs, towards James' room. But he hadn't expected what awaited him at the top of the staircase. Two glowing eyes, sharp as daggers, met his gaze, stopping him cold in his tracks. In a panic, he had fired his gun, the sound shattering the silence of the night. But Shadow had been faster. He had dodged the bullet and lunged, his powerful jaws clamping down on the thief's wrist, forcing him to drop the gun. The man had screamed in terror, stumbling backward, his balance lost. He had tumbled down the stairs, hitting the ground hard, his cries piercing through the night air. Neighbors had come running, alarmed by the gunshot. And then they had seen him, a wolf, a monstrous beast standing over a bleeding man. The panic had been immediate. Someone had called the police. The authorities had arrived within minutes, weapons drawn, demanding that James control the animal. James had begged, pleaded for them to understand. Shadow had saved his life. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't a killer. But fear had already gripped the neighborhood. The law didn't see a hero, it saw a threat. And that was how they had ended up here, in this cold courtroom, standing trial for a crime that wasn't truly a crime. James wasn't a criminal. Shadow wasn't a monster. But the world wasn't kind to those who didn't fit within its rules. James' voice cracked as he continued, his hands trembling. He's my family, Your Honor. I saved him, and he saved me. He's never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. He's loyal. He's kind. He's my only companion in this world. The judge sat in silence, his fingers steepled together as he absorbed the story. The murmurs in the courtroom had quieted. Even those who had entered with fear in their hearts now looked upon the old soldier with something different. Understanding. James sighed, his gaze dropping to Shadow. The wolf looked up at him, his eyes filled with something indescribable. Loyalty, love, trust. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured. The law is clear, Mr. Callahan. Wolves cannot be kept as pets in residential areas. However, given the circumstances and your service to this country, I am willing to consider an alternative solution. James' heart clenched. He knew what was coming. The wolf must be released back into the wild. A sharp pain stabbed through his chest, and for the first time in years, tears welled in his eyes. Please, he whispered. He won't survive out there. He's lived his whole life with me. He doesn't know the wild. He doesn't belong there. The judge sighed, looking down at the papers in front of him. He had made his decision. The law was the law. The courtroom was silent once more, everyone waiting for the final verdict. James clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He couldn't let Shadow go. He couldn't lose him. Not like this. The judge opened his mouth to deliver the final sentence. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as Judge Williams exhaled slowly, his gaze resting on the old soldier standing before him. James Callahan's hands were clenched into trembling fists, his breath shallow. Shadow, his ever-loyal companion, sat obediently at his side, his ears twitching as if sensing the weight of what was to come. The judge adjusted his glasses, looking down at the documents before him, then back at James. The wolf must be released back into the wild, he repeated, his tone softer this time, yet resolute. It is the law. James' knees nearly buckled beneath him, his whole body tensed as if he had just been struck. He had known this was coming, had feared it since the moment the police had arrived that night. But hearing it spoken aloud felt like a death sentence. Not for him, but for Shadow. Your Honor. James' voice was hoarse, his throat tightening. Please, you don't understand. He's lived with me all his life. He doesn't know the wild. He won't survive out there. The courtroom was silent. Even those who had entered with fear in their eyes now watched with something that resembled sympathy. The judge remained quiet for a moment, then sighed. I understand, Mr. Callahan, he said, and I do not doubt the bond you share with this animal. But the law exists to protect both people and wildlife. Keeping a wolf in a residential area is dangerous. The public must be considered. James felt his heart cracking, his breath coming in short gasps. Shadow, sensing his distress, nudged his leg gently with his snout, a quiet reassurance. James looked down, meeting those golden eyes that had watched over him for so many years. How could he let go? Shadow was not just a wolf, he was his family, the only soul in this world who had never left his side. Tears burned behind James' eyes. He had spent a lifetime being strong, being unshakable, being a soldier. But this was a battle he did not know how to win. Your Honor, James' voice cracked, his grip tightening on the leash. He saved my life. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. Doesn't that mean anything? The judge pressed his lips together, troubled. He was silent for a long moment before speaking. I believe you, Mr. Callahan, but the law does not change for sentiment. He turned toward the officers present in the courtroom. The wolf is to be placed in the care of a wildlife sanctuary. where he will be rehabilitated before being released into a protected reserve. James recoiled as though struck. "No," he breathed. "Please, not like this." The officer stepped forward, moving to take the leash from James' hands. Instinctively, Shadow rose, letting out a low, warning growl. James placed a shaking hand on the wolf's head, silencing him. "I'll bring him," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just let me do it myself." The judge hesitated before nodding. "You have 24 hours, Mr. Callahan." The drive to the sanctuary was the longest of James' life. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head resting on James' lap, oblivious to the weight crushing his owner's heart. The old man drove in silence, his eyes burning as he blinked back tears. He had fought in wars, lost friends, seen death up close, but nothing had ever hurt like this. When they arrived at the sanctuary, a kind-faced woman approached, her hands clasped in front of her. "You must be Mr. Callahan," she said gently. "We've prepared a special enclosure for Shadow. He'll be safe here." James swallowed hard. Safe. That word meant nothing if Shadow wasn't with him. He knelt beside the wolf, cupping his face in his calloused hands. "You were never meant to be in the wild," he whispered. "I found you in a war zone, I raised you, I trained you, and now they want you to be something you never were." Shadow licked his face, sensing his sorrow. James' heart shattered. "I love you, boy," he choked. "You saved my life more times than I can count. I'm sorry I couldn't save yours." A single tear slipped down James' cheek as he stood and handed the leash over. As the woman led Shadow away, the wolf paused, looking back, ears perked. His golden eyes met James one last time. Then he was gone. James returned to an empty house, the silence heavier than ever before. Days passed, then weeks. He stopped going outside. He barely ate. The loneliness clawed at him, an ache deeper than any wound he had ever sustained in battle. Then one night, a sound, a scratching at the door. James' heart nearly stopped. Slowly, he moved toward the entrance, his hands trembling as he unlocked it. And there, standing in the porch light, was Shadow. James gasped, falling to his knees. Shadow pressed against him, whining softly, his tail wagging. His fur was ruffled, his paws muddy, but his eyes were bright. He had escaped. He had found his way home. Tears streamed down James' face as he buried his hands in Shadow's thick fur. "You stubborn son of a gun," he whispered. "You really are my Shadow." He knew the police would come. He knew the law would not allow them to stay together. But in that moment, as the old soldier and his wolf sat together on the porch under the moonlit sky, nothing else mattered. Shadow had come home, and James would fight to keep him there.